In 1,850 seconds, Mississippi, a plantation owner brought his slave to church in rags, never knowing her voice would expose decades of lies and destroy the man he trusted most. What started as a simple hymn in a country chapel would unravel forged documents, reveal a dying woman's explosive secret hidden in a family Bible, and force an entire town to choose between money and morality. But when the storm clouds gathered and the patrollers came with their dogs, would a child's perfect pitch be enough to guide 3 souls across the treacherous waters to freedom? The truth Margaret Mercer wrote in Latin would either save them all or see them sold downriver before dawn. Some secrets are worth dying for, but this one was worth living free for. If you're watching this incredible true story unfold, subscribe and tell me what city you're watching from, because every voice matters, just like Elsie's did that fateful Sunday morning. Daybreak crept through the kitchen window of the Mercer plantation, steam rising from the iron kettle as morning light caught the ash dust floating in the air. Elsie stood on her tiptoes at the hearth, stirring grits with a wooden spoon nearly as long as her arm. The kettle's whistle began low and climbed, and she hummed along, matching its pitch exactly. Her voice was small but true, pure as creek water running over stone. The note hung in the kitchen like incense, and for a moment the only sounds were the pop of the hearth log and the soft scrape of her spoon against the pot's bottom. "Child," Ruth whispered from where she kneaded biscuit dough at the worn oak table, "keep that voice quiet." But Elsie's humming had already done its work. Silas Mercer stood in the doorway, his coffee cup halfway to his lips, frozen by the sound. His dead wife had hummed that same tune, in that same key, standing at that very hearth. The memory hit him like a fist to the chest. Ruth's hands stilled in the flour. She knew that look in the master's eyes, the soft, haunted expression that came when grief caught him unguarded. She pulled her daughter closer, the blue ribbon in Elsie's hair catching the lamplight. "Morning, sir," Ruth said, her voice steady as riverbank stones. Silas blinked, the spell broken. "That tune, where did she learn it?" "Don't know, sir. She just hums what she hears." Heavy boots clomped across the porch boards outside. Kerr, the overseer, filled the doorway behind Silas, his broad shoulders blocking the morning light. Dust motes swirled around him like troubled spirits. "Morning inspection," Kerr said, his voice rough as burlap. "Patrollers will be through this week. County's checking papers." His eyes fixed on Ruth and Elsie. "All papers." The coffee cup rattled against its saucer in Silas's hand. Debt pressed on him like water over a drowning man's head. The plantation was failing, creditors circling like buzzards. Kerr knew it. The patrollers knew it. Soon everyone would know. "I'll handle the papers," Silas said. "Will you?" Kerr's smile never reached his eyes. "Good, because I've got buyers asking about field workers. Strong ones." He nodded toward Ruth. "Healthy ones." Ruth's fingers tightened on Elsie's shoulder. The child kept stirring, but her humming stopped. Silas set his cup down hard. "At first bell, the wagon rolls to the country chapel," he announced, reaching for his hat on the peg by the door. "I'm taking the girl." The room went still as a held breath. Kerr's eyebrows rose. Ruth's face went pale. "Sir?" Ruth's voice came out thin. "To chapel, for Sunday service." Silas settled his hat, the brim casting his eyes in shadow. "In her work dress, just as she is." "Master," Kerr said slowly, "patrollers don't take kindly to slaves in church, not dressed like field hands. Then they can speak to me about it." Elsie looked up at her mother, then at the 2 men facing each other across the steamy kitchen. She could feel the weight of something large and dangerous hanging over them, like storm clouds before lightning splits the sky. The chapel bell began to toll in the distance, its bronze note carrying across the cotton fields and into the pine woods. 1, 2, 3 chimes. "Prepare the buckboard," Silas said to no one in particular. "Small one, for 2. Ruth's breath caught. "Sir, not you. Just the girl." The words fell like stones into still water. Ruth pressed her lips together, fighting tears that would help no one. Elsie reached up and took her mother's flour-dusted hand. "It's all right, Mama," she whispered. "I'll sing real soft." But Ruth knew her daughter's voice could no more be soft than the river could run uphill. That voice was a gift, but gifts could be dangerous things in the wrong hands. Isaiah, the stable boy, led the mule Huckle to the small buckboard, wheels creaking as they settled under the wagon's weight. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mist that clung to the cotton rows. Elsie stood beside the wagon in her everyday dress-grey linen, patched at the elbows, hem frayed from wear. Ruth smoothed the child's hair and retied the blue ribbon, her fingers gentle as bird wings. "Here." Ruth pressed a sprig of mint into Elsie's palm. "For breath and courage." The mint was cool and sharp-scented. Elsie closed her fingers around it and felt its oils warm under her touch. Kerr appeared with a folded paper, his pen still wet. "Pass note," he said, handing it to Silas. "Chapel errand." Signed and sealed proper. Silas glanced at the crude wax seal, red as dried blood. "This will do. Keep the girl close," Kerr added, his voice low. "Cale Benton's patrolling today. He's got a sharp eye and a long memory." Ruth's hand tightened on Elsie's shoulder. Everyone knew Cale Benton, a county patroller with a reputation for asking hard questions and accepting no easy answers. "Up you go, child." Silas lifted Elsie onto the wagon seat. She felt small beside him, her feet dangling above. The footboard. Ruth stepped back, her hands clasped tight in front of her apron. "I'll have supper ready when you return. We'll be back before dark." Silas clicked his tongue, and Huckle stepped forward. The wagon wheels found their rhythm, and soon the plantation buildings fell behind as they rolled down the lane between towering pines. The forest closed around them, green, dark, and cool. Shafts of sunlight slanted through the canopy, and somewhere high above, a mockingbird ran through its repertoire of stolen songs. Elsie sat straight as a fence post, the mint sprig warm in her palm, her voice humming low beneath the creak of the wagon boards. Silas listened to her tune and felt his chest grow tight. Margaret's song. Margaret's voice, somehow captured in this child's throat. The coincidence felt too large to be accident, too purposeful to be mere chance. They emerged from the pine shade as the chapel bell tolled again, its bronze voice calling the faithful to worship. Ahead, the small country church sat in a clearing like a ship anchored in a green sea, its white walls bright against the dark trees behind it. Wagons and horses crowded the churchyard. Families in their Sunday best climbed the wooden steps, children in clean clothes chasing between the wheels. The sight of Silas's buckboard turned heads, whispers following in their wake. "There's Mercer, with a slave child. Look at that dress." Elsie felt the stares like cold fingers on her neck. She gripped the mint sprig tighter and hummed her mother's lullaby under her breath. Silas helped her down from the wagon, his hand steady on her arm. "Stay close," he said quietly. "And remember, your voice is a gift. Don't be ashamed of it." The chapel steps felt steep under Elsie's bare feet. The murmur of voices grew louder as they climbed, and she could feel the weight of curious and disapproving eyes. At the top, the heavy oak doors stood open, revealing the dim interior lit by hanging lanterns. Preacher Whitcomb stood at the threshold, his white hair bright in the morning sun. He was a circuit rider, visiting this chapel once a month, carrying God's word from settlement to settlement on horseback and in wagons. "Brother Mercer," the preacher said, extending his hand. Then his gaze dropped to Elsie. "And this young lady?" "My ward," Silas said simply. "Come to hear the word." Murmurs rose from the congregation inside. Someone coughed. A baby fussed and was quickly hushed. Through it all, Elsie heard another sound, boots on the porch boards behind them. She turned and saw a tall man in a black coat, a silver star pinned to his chest. "Patroller." Cale Benton touched his hat brim. "Silas. Brought company today, I see. Come to worship, like everyone else." Benton's pale eyes fixed on Elsie, taking in her patched dress and bare feet. "Papers in order?" Silas showed the pass note. Benton read it slowly, his finger following the words. "Chapel errand," he read aloud. "Signed, by your overseer." His eyes flicked back to Elsie. "What kind of errand requires a field hand in church?" "The kind that's between me and the Lord," Silas replied. The patroller's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Well then, let's see what the Lord has to say about it." Inside the chapel, pine pews stretched toward the simple wooden cross mounted on the far wall. Lanterns hung from the rafters, their flames dancing in the slight breeze from the open doors. The air smelled of pine sap, lamp oil, and the lingering sweetness of last week's funeral flowers. Silas guided Elsie to a pew near the back. but even there, heads turned to stare. A woman in a blue bonnet whispered to her husband, who frowned and shook his head. Children peeked over their parents' shoulders, eyes wide with curiosity. "Scandalous," someone hissed. "Bringing slaves to worship. What's next?" Elsie sat straight as a poker, her hands folded in her lap, the mint sprig hidden in her palm. The blue ribbon in her hair felt bright as a beacon in the lamplight. Preacher Whitcomb moved to the pulpit, his Bible heavy in his hands. The murmuring gradually stilled, but the tension remained thick as summer heat. "Let us begin with a hymn," the preacher announced. "Number 47, Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah." Pages rustled as hymn books opened. The congregation rose to their feet, all except Elsie, who remained seated until Silas's gentle touch on her shoulder brought her upright. "Sing with us, child," he whispered. The hymn began, voices joining in the familiar melody. Some sang with enthusiasm, others mumbled along. But as the first verse progressed, other voices began to fade. One by one, singers stopped to listen, because rising above them all, clear and true as spring water, came Elsie's voice. She sang the opening line, "Guide me, O Thou Great Jehovah, pilgrim through this barren land." The notes hung in the chapel air like silver threads, weaving around the lantern smoke and settling into every corner. Even the babies stopped fussing. Even the children stopped fidgeting. Silas felt tears prick his eyes. This was Margaret's voice, Margaret's gift, somehow preserved and passed down like a family treasure. He watched the faces around him transform from scorn to wonder, from judgment to awe. At the back of the chapel, Cale Benton stood frozen, his hand halfway to his hat. His mouth was slightly open, his pale eyes fixed on the small girl in the patched dress. The hymn continued, but now only Elsie sang, her voice soaring up to the rafters, where dust motes danced in the lantern light. The congregation stood silent, held by the spell of pure sound. When the final note faded, the chapel remained hushed. No one moved, no one spoke. The only sounds were the pop of a log in the back stove and the distant creak of wagon boards outside. Then Silas stood, his voice carrying clearly in the silence. "I cannot call the mother of that voice a servant," he said, the words hanging like a confession in the still air. "I see a wife." Gasps rippled through the congregation. Heads turned. Whispers began again, but different now, shocked, uncertain, touched by something they couldn't quite name. Cale Benton stepped forward, his boots loud on the wooden floor. "That's quite a claim, Mercer." "It's not a claim," Silas replied, his eyes still on Elsie. "It's a recognition." The child looked up at him, still clutching her mint sprig. In her dark eyes, he saw something that reminded him of Margaret, not just in the music, but in the quiet dignity, the strength held carefully in check. Preacher Whitcomb cleared his throat. "Perhaps we might continue this discussion in private, after the service." But the words were already spoken, already hanging in the air like smoke from the lanterns. The congregation buzzed with whispered conversations, heads leaning together, eyes darting between Silas and the small girl at his side. The service continued, but no one was really listening to the sermon. All attention remained fixed on the unlikely pair in the back pew, the plantation owner and the slave child, whose voice had stilled their hearts and opened questions they weren't prepared to answer. When the final blessing was spoken and the congregation began to file out, Elsie remained seated, her hands still folded, the mint sprig now crushed and fragrant in her palm. "What happens now?" she whispered. Silas looked down at her, this child whose voice had somehow unlocked something in his chest, something that felt like hope mixed with grief and possibility. "Now we see what the Lord has in mind," he said, starting with what the preacher keeps in that trunk behind the altar. The last note of Elsie's hymn hung like a thread in the rafters as lantern smoke drifted upward, carrying with it the weight of promises spoken and secrets about to be revealed. The sacristy smelled of old leather and candle wax, yellow light from a single lantern casting long shadows on the pine walls. Preacher Whitcomb unlocked a heavy trunk with a brass key that clinked against the metal hasp. "Your father brought this here when your wife was dying," he said to Silas, lifting out a leather-bound book thick as a man's fist. "Asked me to keep it safe." The Mercer family Bible felt heavy in Silas's hands. Its cover was worn smooth by generations of fingers, the gold lettering faded but still readable. He'd forgotten his father had hidden it here, away from creditors and curious eyes. Elsie stood close beside him, her fingers tracing the air above the old leather. "It smells like the doctor's house," she said. "Like medicines and learning. You've been to Dr. Hart's?" the preacher asked. "When his wife was poorly, Mama helped nurse her. She taught me letters from her Latin books." Silas opened the Bible carefully. The pages fell naturally to the book of Ruth, where a slim blue ribbon marked a favorite passage. But it was the margins that caught Elsie's attention, faint handwriting in brown ink, words that looked different from the printed text. "What does that say?" Silas asked, pointing to the marginal notes. Elsie squinted at the careful script, sounding out syllables the way Dr. Hart's wife had taught her. "Ruth and her child are to be freed upon," she paused, working through the unfamiliar words. "Upon public witness of the girl's hymn." The sacristy went dead quiet. Outside, they could hear wagon wheels on the gravel and the distant voices of the departing congregation. But inside, the only sound was Preacher Whitcomb's sharp intake of breath. "That's Latin," he said, "written in your wife's hand." Silas stared at the margin, his heart pounding. Margaret's handwriting, small and precise. Margaret's words, hidden in plain sight among the Holy Scriptures. "When?" he whispered. "Look at the date," Elsie said, pointing to a tiny notation at the end of the text. "The numbers are clear. 2 weeks before she died," Silas read. His voice cracked. "She wrote this 2 weeks before she died." Ruth appeared in the doorway, her face tight with worry. "Sir, is everything well?" Behind her, Kerr's shadow fell across the threshold. "Papers or no?" His voice cut through the lamplight. "Debts come due by Friday, and I've got buyers interested in strong workers." The family Bible trembled in Silas's hands. Margaret's final gift, Margaret's last act of love, not just for him, but for the woman who had sung lullabies to comfort them both, and for the child whose voice carried the echo of old mercies. "Ruth," he said quietly, "come see what my wife left for you." She stepped into the sacristy, Elsie taking her hand. Together they bent over the open Bible, mother and daughter reading the words that promised freedom if they could prove the condition had been met. Outside, the last wagon creaked away from the chapel, leaving only the sound of wind in the pines and the distant call of a whippoorwill. But inside the small room, 4 people stared at a page that might change everything, if they had the courage to claim what it offered. The lantern flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the sacred words. Somewhere in the growing darkness, Cale Benton sat his horse at the edge of the churchyard, watching the lamplight in the chapel windows and wondering what secrets were being shared in the holy shadows. Monday morning brought mist over the cotton fields and trouble walking up the plantation lane. Kerr strode to the kitchen porch with papers folded in his coat, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. Behind him, 2 county men sat their horses in the yard, official and patient as death. "Moving papers," Kerr announced, slapping the documents on the kitchen table where Ruth was rolling biscuit dough. "For Ruth and the girl. Buyer down in Natchez needs workers by week's end." Flour dust rose from the table like a small white cloud. Ruth's hands stilled on the tame rolling pin, her knuckles going white. Silas appeared in the doorway, still pulling on his coat. "Let me see those." The papers looked official enough, county seals, proper signatures, the kind of documentation that moved human property from one place to another with no questions asked. But something about them made Silas's chest tighten. "Mighty sudden," he said, studying the ink. "Debts are mighty pressing," Kerr replied. "You want to keep this place running. You need to make hard choices." Elsie peeked around her mother's skirts, her eyes fixed on the papers. She'd learned to read documents at Dr. Hart's house, helping his wife with medical orders and supply lists. These papers had the right words, but something felt wrong about them. "The seal," she whispered to Ruth. "It's the wrong color." Ruth hushed her with a gentle touch, but not before Kerr's sharp ears caught the words. "What did she say?" "Nothing," Silas said quickly. "Child's just scared." But Elsie was studying the wax impression more closely, her small fingers hovering above the red seal. At Dr. Hart's house, she'd seen dozens of county documents. The official seal was always blue wax, never red. And the letter R in the clerk's signature looked different, rounder, clumsier than the careful script she'd seen on legitimate papers. "Sir," she said quietly to Silas, "this isn't right." Kerr's face darkened. "You teaching slaves to read now? That's against the law. She learned at Dr. Hart's," Silas said, "while helping with his wife's medical needs. Well, she can read her way down to Natchez. These papers are legal and proper." But doubt was growing in Silas's mind like a canker. The hastiness of it all, the convenient timing just after Sunday's chapel incident, the way Kerr avoided his eyes when showing the documents. "I want these verified," he said. "At the courthouse." Kerr's jaw tightened. "No need for that. I've done the verification myself." "Then you won't mind doing it again." The two men stared at each other across the kitchen table while Ruth held her daughter close. Outside, morning light grew stronger, burning off the mist and revealing the cotton fields stretching toward the pine woods. "Fine," Kerr said finally, "but the buyers expect delivery by Friday. Delay costs money." After Kerr and the county men rode away, Silas found Preacher Whitcomb at the chapel, preparing for a wedding later in the week. The old circuit rider looked up from polishing the communion silver, his weathered hands steady on the cloth. "That hymn yesterday," Silas began. "You said something about it having verses. All hymns have verses, but this one. You looked like you recognized something more than just the tune." The preacher set down a silver cup and studied Silas's face. "Some songs carry more than music," he said carefully. "Some carry directions." "What kind of directions?" Whitcomb glanced toward the chapel doors, making sure they were alone. "The kind that help folks find safe harbors, lantern timings, ferry schedules, which doors open to strangers in the dark." Silas felt his pulse quicken. "You're saying the hymn is some kind of code? I'm saying music travels where words can't go. And sometimes, when words are dangerous, music carries the message." The preacher moved to the window, looking out at the pine woods that stretched toward the river. "There's a Quaker boatman named Ezra Albright, runs a ferry crossing 10 miles north. His wife knows that hymn, knows what it means. If you need safe passage." "I might," Silas said, "depending on what we find at the courthouse. Then you should know the second verse by heart, and the third, if matters get truly desperate." That afternoon, Silas drove the small buckboard to town with Elsie beside him, the disputed papers folded in his coat pocket. The courthouse stood on the square like a brick monument to order and law, its columns white against the red walls. Inside, Clerk Tally examined the papers with a magnifying glass, comparing them to county records and seal impressions. Elsie stood quietly beside Silas, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "The wax color," she whispered, "and the ink weight on that letter." Tally looked up sharply. "What's she seeing?" "Nothing official," Silas said quickly. "Just curious." But the clerk was already comparing the seal color to his official stamp pad. Blue wax, not red. And when he held the signature to the light, the ink weight was clearly different from his usual careful script. "Where did you get these?" he asked. "My overseer said they were county issued." Tally's face grew grim. "These are forgeries. Good ones, but forgeries nonetheless. The question is, who benefits from moving your workers so suddenly?" The answer hung in the air like gun smoke. Kerr had been skimming from the plantation accounts for months, Silas suspected. Moving Ruth and Elsie to distant buyers would eliminate witnesses and provide quick cash to cover his theft. "I need to check our ledgers," Silas said. "All of them. Bring everything to me," Tally advised. "Papers, books, anything with signatures or seals. If there's fraud here, we need to expose it before more damage is done." They drove home as the sun slanted low through the pine trees, Elsie humming softly beside him. But now her tune sounded different to Silas, not just melody, but message. Words within words, directions wrapped in song. "That second verse," he said. "The one Preacher Whitcomb mentioned. Do you know it?" Elsie nodded. "Mama taught it to me, about crossing waters and finding light. Can you teach it to me?" So as they rolled through the gathering dusk, the plantation owner and the slave child shared the secret verses that might, if God willed it, carry them all to safety. The hymn rose and fell with the rhythm of the wagon wheels, its hidden meanings unfolding like flowers in the darkness. Behind them, unseen in the dark pine shadows, Cale Benton sat his horse and listened to the singing. his sharp mind already working on the implications of what he'd witnessed at the courthouse. Some songs, he knew, were more dangerous than weapons. That evening brought storm clouds building over the cotton fields, thunder rumbling low in the distance like God's own drums. Ruth prepared supper in the kitchen while Elsie helped set the table, both of them moving quietly around each other in the way of women who share work and worry. Silas sat at his desk in the front room, going through ledgers by lamplight, page after page of accounts, crop yields, expenses, and worker records. Everything looked proper on the surface, but underneath he could sense the careful deception of altered numbers and convenient omissions. A knock at the front door made him look up. Through the window he saw a small figure in a dark bonnet, Widow Albright from the river ferry, her wagon and mule waiting in the yard. "Evening, Silas," she said when he opened the door. "My husband Ezra sent me. Said you might have need of the ferry service soon." She was a tiny woman, barely 5 feet tall, but her eyes held the kind of steady strength that came from years of helping desperate people cross dark waters. Silas had heard whispers about the Albrights' Quaker folk who ran their ferry for profit, but also for mercy. "Come in," he said. "Coffee's still warm." In the kitchen, Ruth served coffee in tin cups, while Widow Albright studied the family Bible, still open to the page with Margaret's hidden clause. Her weathered finger traced the Latin text with obvious familiarity. "Thee knows this language?" she asked Ruth. "Some. Learned it nursing the doctor's wife." "And the child?" "She reads better than most grown folks," Ruth admitted. "Has the gift for it." Widow Albright smiled. "Gifts have their purpose, don't they? This one especially." She turned to Elsie. "Child, sing me the second verse of thy hymn." Elsie glanced at her mother, who nodded. Then, her voice clear and true, she sang, "When I tread the verge of Jordan, bid my anxious fears subside, death of death and hell's destruction. Land me safe on Canaan's side." "Now the hidden verse," Widow Albright said softly, "the one thy mother taught thee in private." Elsie's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, the words coming slow and careful. "2 lanterns mark the crossing point, 3 knocks upon the darkened door, white cloth upon the morning porch, means passage to the farther shore." Silas felt his breath catch. The hymn wasn't just song, it was a map. Directions for finding safe passage across the river, coded in verses that could be sung in any chapel without arousing suspicion. "Ezra will be watching for signals," Widow Albright said. "2 lanterns at the ferry landing, white cloth on our porch, but thee must be careful. Kerr has been asking questions about ferry schedules." Thunder crashed overhead, closer now. Rain began pattering on the tin roof. Light at first, then harder. Through the kitchen window, they could see lamplight in the overseer's quarters, Kerr moving about in the yellow glow. "He's watching too," Ruth said quietly. "Has been since Sunday. Then we move careful and quiet," Widow Albright replied. "My wagon's sturdy, room under the cover for 3, if need be." "3?" Silas looked up from the ledgers. "Thee thinks to send them alone, after what happened at chapel?" The tiny woman's voice carried surprising steel. "Thy words marked them, Silas Mercer. Now thee must see it through." More thunder, and the rain drumming harder on the roof. Elsie curled up in her mother's lap, humming softly as Ruth stroked her hair. The blue ribbon gleamed in the lamplight like a small flag of hope. "Friday," Silas said finally. "If the courthouse confirms the forgeries, we move Friday night." Widow Albright nodded. "Ezra will be ready. But mind thee, if Kerr suspects anything, he'll have patrollers waiting at the regular crossing. Thee may need to use the old ford, 2 miles upstream." "How will we know?" "The hymn will tell thee. 3rd verse has directions to the alternate route." She stood, pulling her bonnet tight. "Storm's getting worse. I should return before the creeks rise." At the door, she paused. "Silas, what thy wife wrote in that Bible, it's not just legal words, it's prophecy." That child's voice was meant to set things right. After she left, the 3 of them sat around the kitchen table, listening to the storm and planning for what might come. Ruth packed a small bag with medicines and provisions. Silas cleaned his hunting rifle and counted the coins hidden behind loose bricks in the fireplace. Elsie practiced the secret verses, her voice barely audible above the rain. The storm raged until near midnight, then moved east toward the river, leaving behind the clean smell of washed air and the steady drip of water from the eaves. They went to bed with the sound of night creatures calling through the darkness, but sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of journeys and crossings and the fading echo of a hymn that carried more than music. In his quarters across the yard, Kerr sat up late by his own lamp, writing letters to buyers downriver and making plans that had nothing to do with legitimate business. The forged papers were just the beginning. By week's end, he intended to be gone with enough stolen money to buy land in Texas, leaving Silas and his debts far behind. But some plans, like some songs, carry seeds of their own destruction, and the storm that night washed more than the air clean. It also revealed tracks and hiding places and secrets that had been waiting in the darkness for their moment to emerge. Wednesday brought clear skies and trouble walking up the lane in the person of Cale Benton, the county patroller. He rode a black gelding that stepped high and proud, its hooves ringing on the packed dirt of the plantation drive. "Morning inspection," he announced from horseback, not bothering to dismount. "County's checking compliance with travel regulations." Silas met him on the porch, deliberately casual, coffee cup in hand. "All in order here. We'll see about that." Benton's pale eyes swept the yard, taking in the workers heading to the fields, the chimney smoke from the kitchen, the general air of a plantation going about its business. "Heard there was some excitement at chapel Sunday. Just a hymn sing. Nothing more." "Funny thing about hymns," Benton said, swinging down from his saddle. "Some of them carry messages. Underground Railroad uses music to pass signals, you know. I wouldn't know about that." But Benton was already walking toward the kitchen, his boots loud on the porch boards. Inside, Ruth stood at the stove, stirring a pot of beans. Elsie sat nearby with a primer, practicing letters by tracing them in flour scattered on a wooden board. "Learning to read," Benton observed. "That's against regulations." "She's helping with medical preparations," Silas said quickly. "Doctor. Hart uses her to read medicine labels. Does he now?" Benton picked up one of the forged papers from the kitchen table, studying it with careful eyes. "These look familiar. My office processes a lot of travel documents." Elsie glanced up from her flower board, her eyes fixing on the paper in Benton's hands. She'd been thinking about those documents for 2 days, turning over the details that felt wrong. Now, seeing them in better light, she noticed something new. "The pen," she whispered to her mother. "It's the same as the ledger." Ruth hushed her quickly, but Benton's sharp ears caught the words. "What ledger?" Silas felt sweat break out between his shoulder blades. "Nothing important. Household accounts. Show me." There was no refusing a direct order from a county patroller. Silas led Benton to the front room, where the plantation ledgers sat open on his desk. Page after page of careful entries, crop records, expenses, worker assignments. Benton studied the handwriting, comparing it to the signatures on the travel documents. His eyes moved back and forth between the pages, looking for matches and discrepancies. "Different hands," he concluded. "The ledger's yours. These papers." He held up the forged documents. "These were written by someone trying to copy official script. See how the pressure's uneven? Amateur work. You're saying they're forgeries?" "I'm saying whoever wrote them should stick to ledger keeping." Benton's smile was sharp as a blade. "Question is, why would someone forge county travel documents?" Before Silas could answer, Kerr appeared in the doorway, his face flushed from hard riding. "Patroller Benton. Didn't expect you today. Surprise inspections are the most effective kind." Benton's voice was mild, but his eyes were predatory. "We were just discussing these travel papers." "Interesting craftsmanship." Kerr's face went pale, then red. "Those are legitimate county documents." "Are they?" Clerk Tally seemed to think otherwise when we checked them yesterday. The room went dead quiet. Outside, they could hear the normal sounds of plantation life workers singing in the fields, mules snorting in the traces, the distant ring of hammer on anvil from the blacksmith's shop. But inside the front room, 4 people stood frozen in a moment that would determine the course of several lives. "There's been a mistake," Kerr said finally. "I can explain. I'm sure you can." Benton folded the papers carefully. "Down at the county jail, where we have plenty of time for explanations." But Kerr was already moving, heading for the back door with the speed of a man who knew his lies had finally caught up with him. Benton followed, his hand on his pistol, shouting for the overseer to stop. In the confusion, Elsie tugged at Silas's sleeve. "The ledger," she whispered urgently. "Look at the back pages." Silas flipped to the rear of the accounts book, where he found pages he'd never seen before, entries in Kerr's handwriting, recording sale prices for workers who'd supposedly been transferred to other plantations. Ruth's name was there, with a date for this Friday and a buyer's mark from Natchez. "He's been planning this for weeks," Silas breathed. "Planning what?" Ruth asked. "To sell you both downriver." The forged papers were just the beginning. Outside, they could hear shouting as Kerr made for the stables, trying to reach his horse before Benton could stop him. But the patroller was faster and more experienced. His voice cracked like a whip across the yard. "Stop right there, or I'll drop you where you stand." The shouting stopped. When Silas looked out the window, he saw Kerr standing in the stable yard with his hands raised, Benton's pistol trained on his back. "Well," Ruth said quietly, "I suppose that settles the question of the papers." But even as she spoke, they could see dust rising from the road, more riders approaching fast. Word was spreading that something unusual was happening at the Mercer plantation, and in a place where secrets were dangerous, unusual events drew attention like honey drew flies. "Pack quickly," Silas told Ruth. "Just the necessities. We may need to leave sooner than planned." Elsie had moved to the family Bible, still open to the page with Margaret's hidden clause. Her small finger traced the Latin words, and she began to hum not the familiar first verse of the hymn, but the secret third verse that Widow Albright had taught her. The one that pointed toward alternate routes and hidden crossings when the regular paths became too dangerous to travel. The afternoon sun slanted through the front room windows, highlighting the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Change was coming, faster than they'd planned and more dangerous than they'd hoped. But the hymn held its own power, its own promise of guidance, through dark waters toward whatever shore waited beyond. By Thursday evening, news of Kerr's arrest had spread through the county like fire through dry grass. The plantation felt different without his heavy presence, quieter, but also more dangerous, like the stillness before a tornado touches down. Silas sat at his desk, reading through papers that Cale Benton had left behind after hauling Kerr to jail. Ledgers within ledgers, hidden accounts, false bills of sale. The scope of the theft was staggering. Kerr had been systematically looting the plantation for over a year, setting up sales of workers to cover his tracks and provide escape money. "How much?" Ruth asked quietly from the doorway. "Enough to buy a spread in Texas. Maybe more." Silas rubbed his eyes, feeling older than his 43 years. The man was thorough, I'll give him that. Elsie appeared beside her mother, the family Bible clutched against her chest. She'd been carrying it everywhere since Sunday, as if the weight of Margaret's words could protect them all. "Are we leaving tonight?" she asked. "Tomorrow night." "Friday, like we planned." Silas closed the ledger with a snap. "Ezra Albright sent word. The ferry'll be ready after midnight, when the regular patrols change shift." Thunder rumbled in the distance, another storm building over the river. The autumn weather had been unsettled all week, as if nature itself was responding to the tension that gripped the county. Ruth moved to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. "Feel that pressure change? Storm's going to be a hard one." She was right. The air felt thick and electric, the kind of weather that made animals nervous and children fretful. In the distance, lightning flickered like a candle flame in God's window. "Might work in our favor," Silas said. "Storm keeps folks indoors, minds their own business." But even as he spoke, they could see lanterns moving in the woods beyond the cotton fields. Word of Kerr's crimes had brought out the curious and the suspicious in equal measure. Some folks wanted to help, others wanted to see justice done their own way. "Company coming," Ruth observed. 3 riders emerged from the pine woods, their horses picking careful paths through the muddy field roads. Leading them was Dr. Hart, his black bag bouncing against his hip. Behind him rode 2 men. Silas recognized farmers from the next county over, good men who'd known Margaret before she married. "Evening, Silas," Dr. Hart called as they approached the porch. "Heard you've had some troubles." "Nothing I can't handle." "Maybe so." Hart dismounted, his movements careful in the growing darkness. "But sometimes a man needs friends, especially when he's trying to do right by folks." The other 2 riders, Tom Albright, Ezra's brother, and a Methodist preacher named Samuel Cross, nodded their agreement. These were men who understood the weight of conscience and the price of moral courage. "Come inside," Silas said. "Coffee's still warm." In the kitchen, Ruth served coffee in her best cups, while Elsie sat quietly in the corner, the Bible still pressed against her chest. The men spoke in low voices about Kerr's crimes, about the forged papers, about the implications for the whole county. "Question is, Doctor," Hart said finally, "what happens next? To Ruth and the child, I mean." "We follow Margaret's wishes," Silas replied. "The manumission clause is clear." "Clear to us," Preacher Cross observed, "but the county court might see things differently. Judge Rawlins is a strict constructionist when it comes to property law." Tom Albright leaned forward. "Which is why we need to make sure everything's done proper. No room for legal challenges." Outside, the storm was building in earnest. Lightning flashed closer now, illuminating the cotton fields in stark white relief. Thunder followed, louder and more insistent. "Storm's going to break soon," Ruth said, glancing toward the window. "Hard one, by the feel of it." "All the more reason to move careful," Dr. Hart replied. He opened his black bag and withdrew a folded paper. "I brought something that might help. Medical certification that Elsie's been in my employ as a reading assistant. Gives you legal cover for her education." Silas took the paper gratefully. Every legitimate document strengthened their position, made it harder for enemies to challenge their claims. "There's more," Preacher Cross added. "I've been in touch with the Methodist Circuit. We can provide sanctuary at churches all the way to the Ohio border, if need be." "It won't come to that," Silas said firmly. "We settle this here, in our own county, according to our own laws." But even as he spoke, they could hear the sound of more horses on the road, riders moving fast through the gathering storm. Too fast for casual travelers, too purposeful for folks simply heading home before the rain. Tom Albright moved to the window. "Patrollers," he said quietly. 6 of them, coming hard. Lightning split the sky directly overhead, illuminating the approaching riders in stark detail. Leading them was Deputy Marshal Kane from the county seat, a man known for his strict enforcement of slave codes and his dislike of what he called abolition sympathizers. "Back door, Doctor," Hart said quickly. "We'll draw them off, give you time to reach the ferry." But Ruth was already shaking her head. "No running, not from our own kitchen. We face this proper, with the Bible and the law on our side." Elsie stood up, still clutching the heavy book. In the lamplight, her face looked older than her 8 years, marked by an understanding that should have been beyond her years. "The 3rd verse," she said quietly. "I should sing the 3rd verse now." The men looked puzzled, but Ruth understood. The secret verse that contained directions for alternate routes, backup plans when the main roads became too dangerous. "Not yet, baby," she whispered. "Save it for when we truly need it." The patrollers' voices carried across the yard as they dismounted, their boots loud on the wet earth. Deputy Kane's voice rose above the rest, sharp with authority and suspicion. "Mercer, come out here. We need to talk." Through the kitchen window, they could see the lawmen spreading out around the house, lanterns casting wild shadows in the pre-storm darkness. These weren't men come for friendly conversation. They were here to enforce what they saw as proper order, regardless of what Margaret's Bible might say about freedom and dignity. "Stay close," Silas told Ruth and Elsie. "Whatever happens, stay close." The storm broke just as Kane's fist pounded on the front door, rain coming down like a judgment, wind howling through the pines, lightning turning the world white and terrible. In that moment of thunder and chaos, everything balanced on a knife's edge. And in the kitchen, a small girl with perfect pitch began to hum, a hymn that carried more than music, while her mother held her close, and a man tried to honor the memory of a wife who had believed that justice, like love, was something worth fighting for. The storm had come at last, and with it, the test of whether courage could triumph over custom, whether the voice of a child could indeed set captives free. Deputy Kane's fist hammered the door again, the sound sharp even over the storm's roar. "Mercer, open up, or we'll come in uninvited." Silas exchanged glances with the men gathered in his kitchen. Dr. Hart nodded toward the back door, but Ruth stood firm beside the table, one hand on Elsie's shoulder. "We go out the front," she said quietly. "With dignity." "Ruth," Silas began. "No. We meet them honest, or we don't meet them at all." Thunder crashed overhead as Silas opened the front door. Kane stood on the porch, rain dripping from his hat brim. 5 deputies spread out behind him in the yard. Lightning illuminated their faces in harsh relief. Men come to do what they saw as duty, regardless of conscience. "Deputy," Silas said. "Rough night for traveling. Rough night for hiding fugitives too," Kane replied, pushing past him into the front room. His eyes took in the gathered men, the family Bible open on the table, the obvious signs of hasty preparation for travel. "No fugitives here. Just family." Kane's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Family? That what we're calling it now?" His eyes fixed on Ruth and Elsie, standing in the kitchen doorway. "Got word there's been some talk about illegal manumission. Can't have that kind of nonsense spreading." Dr. Hart stepped forward. "Marshal, these people have legitimate cause. I'll determine what's legitimate." Kane's hand moved to his pistol. "Right now, I see stolen property and the men who stole it." The words hit like physical blows. Ruth's face went pale, but she stood straighter, her chin lifted in quiet defiance. Elsie pressed closer to her mother's side, the Bible heavy in her small arms. "The law says otherwise," Silas said, keeping his voice level. "Written law, properly witnessed." "What law?" "Show me." Silas gestured toward the open Bible. "My wife's manumission clause." Written in her own hand, dated and witnessed. Kane moved to the table, water from his coat dripping onto the sacred pages. He studied the marginal notes with obvious skepticism. "Latin," he said dismissively. "Could say anything. Could be grocery lists for all I know." "I can read it," Elsie said quietly from the doorway. The room went dead still. Kane's head turned slowly toward the child, his pale eyes narrowing. "What did you say?" "I said I can read it. The Latin words. Missus. Hart taught me, when I helped nurse her through the fever." Kane's face darkened. "Illegal education of a slave. That's a federal offense." "She's not a slave," Dr. Hart interjected. "She's been working as my medical assistant. I have documentation. Convenient documentation, I'm sure." Kane's voice was thick with contempt. Amazing how many papers appear when the law gets inconvenient. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury. Wind howled through the pine trees, and rain hammered the tin roof like bullets. Lightning flashed almost continuously now, turning the world into a succession of stark, white tableaux. "Read it then," Kane demanded, pointing at the Bible. "If you're so educated, read the Latin out loud. Let's see what your dead mistress really wrote." Elsie looked at her mother, who nodded slightly. Then the child stepped forward, the Bible heavy in her hands, and began to translate the careful script in the margin. "Ruth, wife to my heart, though not in law, and her child Elsie, born of love, if not of marriage, are to be freed upon public witness of the girl's hymn before God and the congregation." Her voice was clear and precise, each Latin word carefully pronounced. The silence that followed was broken only by the storm's fury and the sound of water dripping from Kane's coat. "Public witness," the deputy repeated slowly, "before God and congregation. That happened yet?" "Sunday last," Preacher Cross said from the back of the room. "I was there." "So was half the county, including Patroller Benton," Tom Albright added. He heard every note. Kane's jaw worked as he processed this information. A legal condition fulfilled in public, witnessed by a county official. It would be hard to argue with, even for a man determined to see property where others saw people. "Doesn't matter," he said finally. "Until a judge rules official, these are still slaves, and I have orders to prevent any illegal transportation of same." "Whose orders?" "Doctor," Hart demanded. "County commissioners. Got word that abolitionists might be using this whole business as cover for underground railroad activity." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Outside, lightning struck close enough to shake the windows, followed by thunder that seemed to come from the earth itself. "No one here's an abolitionist," Silas said carefully. "We're just trying to honor a dying woman's wishes." "Sure you are." Kane's smile was cold as winter. "Which is why you've got ferry schedules and travel hymns and emergency supplies all laid out nice and convenient." Elsie had been listening to the conversation with growing understanding. These men weren't here to uphold justice, they were here to prevent it. The legal niceties didn't matter to them. What mattered was maintaining a system that treated people as property, regardless of what dying wives might write in family Bibles. She began to hum, very softly, the tune that had started everything. But this time it wasn't the familiar first verse. It was the secret third verse, the one that contained directions for alternate routes when the main roads became impassable. Ruth heard it first, her head turning sharply toward her daughter. Then Tom Albright caught the melody, his eyes widening with recognition. The hymn was changing, becoming something else, a signal, a call for help, a coded message that some of them understood. Outside, through the storm and darkness, answering lanterns began to flicker. 2 lights at the ferry landing, 3 more from the Methodist chapel, white cloth appearing on porches despite the driving rain. The Underground Railroad was activating, called to life by a child's voice raised in defiant song. Cain heard it too, his hand tightening on his pistol. "Stop that singing." But Elsie continued, her voice growing stronger, the sacred words weaving through the storm like a prayer made audible. And across the county, in houses and churches and ferry landings, other voices began to join in, creating a network of song that ran deeper than law and stronger than fear. The battle for Ruth and Elsie's freedom was about to begin in earnest. The hymn spread across the storm-lashed county like wildfire through dry grass. From the Mercer plantation, Elsie's clear voice carried the signal. At the ferry landing, Ezra Albright heard it and lit 2 lanterns as the wind howled through the guy wires. In the Methodist chapel, Preacher Cross's wife began the melody, and it was taken up by a dozen voices sheltering from the storm. Deputy Cain drew his pistol. I said, "Stop that singing." But the sound was beyond stopping now. Like water finding its course, the hymn flowed from house to house, creating a chain of music that stretched from the plantation to the river and beyond. Cain's deputies looked nervous, their hands moving to their weapons but uncertain what they were supposed to shoot. "It's just a song, Doctor," Hart said, but his voice carried an edge of satisfaction. "It's a signal," Cain snapped. "Underground Railroad signal. I've heard about this kind of thing." Outside, they could hear horses approaching through the storm, more riders coming fast despite the dangerous conditions. But were they reinforcements for Cain, or something else? Entirely. Ruth made the decision for all of them. She moved to the family Bible and closed it with a firm snap, then wrapped it in oilcloth against the rain. "We're leaving," she announced. "Now, while we still can." "You're not going anywhere," Cain said, raising his pistol. "You going to shoot a woman for trying to honor her mistress's dying wish?" Tom Albright asked quietly. "In front of witnesses, including a doctor and 2 preachers?" Cain hesitated. Killing unarmed people in front of respectable witnesses was a different matter than enforcing slave codes, especially when those witnesses included men with connections throughout the county. The sound of approaching horses grew louder. Through the rain-lashed windows, they could see lantern light bobbing through the darkness, a dozen riders at least, maybe more. "Widow Albright," Tom said, recognizing the lead rider, "and half the Methodist congregation." The tiny woman sat her mule with the dignity of a general commanding troops. Behind her came farmers and shopkeepers, the doctor's wife despite her recent illness, even the blacksmith with his massive arms and steady hands. They weren't armed in any conventional sense, but they carried something that might be more powerful, the weight of community conscience. Cain's deputies began to look uncertain. 6 lawmen against 40 citizens was odds that made even the most confident man think twice. "This is illegal assembly," Cain called out, as Widow Albright dismounted. "This is Christian witness," she replied, her small voice somehow carrying clearly through the storm. "We've come to see justice done according to law and scripture." She walked up the porch steps, rain streaming from her bonnet, and stood face to face with the deputy marshal. At barely 5 feet tall, she should have been dwarfed by his bulk, but somehow the opposite seemed true. "Margaret Mercer was my friend," she said quietly. "I helped lay her out for burial. I heard her final words about freedom and dignity. Thee will not prevent those words from being honored. I have legal authority. Thee has a gun and a badge. Not the same thing as authority." More riders were arriving, Quakers from upriver, Methodists from 3 counties over, even some Baptists who normally wouldn't speak to the other denominations. The hymn had reached them all, calling them out into the storm to witness whatever happened next. Inside the house, Elsie tugged at her mother's skirt. "Mama, I know the way to the old ford. The third verse tells it plain. Ruth looked down at her daughter, this child whose voice had set all of this in motion. 8 years old and already carrying the weight of other people's freedom on her small shoulders. You sure, baby? Yes, ma'am. 2 miles upstream, where the big oak leans over the water. Widow Albright's got a rope ferry there for emergencies. Silas heard them talking and moved closer. Emergency ferry? For times when the main fort, crossings watched, Ruth explained. Ezra keeps it ready, just in case. Outside, the crowd was growing larger. Word had somehow spread faster than the storm itself, bringing people out into the dangerous night to see if the child's hymn would indeed set captives free. Cain was outnumbered now, 20-1 at least. His deputies looked ready to bolt, and he was smart enough to know that using force against this many witnesses would end his career and possibly his life. This isn't over, he said, holstering his pistol. Judge Rawlins will hear about this. Federal marshals, too. Good, Widow Albright replied. Let them come. Let them see how free people honor their obligations. The deputy and his men mounted up and rode away into the storm, their lantern light quickly swallowed by the darkness. But the crowd remained, forming a protective circle around the house as Silas, Ruth, and Elsie prepared for their journey to the courthouse in town. No more hiding, Ruth said firmly. We go straight to Judge Rawlins, storm or no storm, present the Bible and the witnesses, and let the law decide. Dr. Hart nodded. I'll ride with you, so will the preachers. Make it official, and I'll take thee in my wagon, Widow Albright added, sturdy enough for any road, storm, or shine. As they prepared to leave, Elsie stood on the porch one last time, looking out at the crowd of faces illuminated by lantern light and lightning. These people had come out in a dangerous storm because of her song, because of words her dead mistress had written in a family Bible. She began to sing again, but this time it was the first verse, the familiar words that everyone knew. One by one, the crowd joined in, 40 voices raised together in the storm. Guide me, O thou great Jehovah, pilgrim through this barren land. I am weak, but thou art mighty. Hold me with thy powerful hand. The hymn rose over the wind and rain, carrying across the county like a declaration of faith. At the courthouse in town, Judge Rawlins heard it from his upstairs window and knew that morning would bring decisions that would test everything he believed about law and justice. The storm raged on, but the song was stronger, weaving through the darkness like a thread of light that connected all the scattered souls who believed in the radical idea that every person, regardless of color or station, possessed a dignity that no earthly law could erase. The ride to town took 2 hours through mud and storm, but they never rode alone. The crowd that had gathered at the plantation became a procession, lanterns bobbing through the darkness like fireflies in a jar. Widow Albright's wagon held steady despite the rutted roads, her mule picking careful steps through the worst of the weather. Inside the covered wagon bed, Ruth held Elsie close while Silas clutched the oilcloth-wrapped Bible. The child had fallen quiet, worn out by the evening's events, but her breathing kept time with the wagon's rhythm, as if she were still humming in her sleep. Almost there, Dr. Hart called from horseback alongside the wagon. Lightning illuminated the courthouse square ahead, and they could see lights in the upper windows where Judge Rawlins kept his chambers. The procession pulled up before the courthouse steps just as the storm reached its peak. Rain hammered the brick building, and wind howled through the great columns that supported the portico. But inside, warm lamplight glowed, and they could see the judge's silhouette moving behind the upstairs windows. "He's awake," Preacher Cross observed. "Probably heard us coming. Hard not to," Tom Albright replied with satisfaction. 40 people don't travel quiet, even in a storm. Widow Albright set the wagon brake and climbed down, her small frame immediately soaked by the driving rain. "Come on then. Let's get this settled proper." They climbed the courthouse steps in a group, Silas carrying the Bible, Ruth holding Elsie's hand, the preachers and doctor flanking them like honor guards. Behind them came the citizens who'd followed through the storm, their faces set with the kind of determination that brooks no argument. The courthouse doors were heavy oak, carved with county seals and dates reaching back to territorial days. Silas pushed them open, and they entered a marble-floored lobby that echoed with their wet footsteps. Judge Rawlins appeared at the top of the central staircase, a robe thrown over his nightclothes, his grey hair wild from sleep. He was a small man, but his voice carried the authority of 40 years on the bench. "What's the meaning of this disturbance? It's past midnight." "Begging your pardon, Judge," Silas called up, "but we have legal business that can't wait for morning." "Legal business? In the middle of a storm?" "Manumission papers, Your Honor," Dr. Hart added. "Time-sensitive matter involving federal slave codes." Judge Rawlins studied the crowd below, taking in the mix of farmers and tradesmen, the two preachers, the doctor's familiar face. These weren't rabble-rousers or troublemakers. These were solid citizens, the kind of people who formed the backbone of county society. "Come up, then," he said finally, but quietly. "My clerk's asleep, and I'd like to keep it that way." The judge's chambers smelled of pipe smoke and old leather, law books lining the walls from floor to ceiling. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and lamplight cast dancing shadows across the worn wooden floors. "Now then," Rawlins said, settling behind his desk. "What's this about?" Silas unwrapped the family Bible and opened it to the page with Margaret's marginalia. The Latin words seemed to glow in the lamplight, as if they carried their own illumination. "My wife's final instructions, Your Honor, written in her own hand 2 weeks before she died." The judge put on his spectacles and leaned forward, studying the careful script. His lips moved silently as he worked through the Latin, his eyebrows rising with each translated phrase. "Manumission clause," he said finally, "conditional on public witness of the girl's hymn." His eyes moved to Elsie, standing quietly beside her mother. "This the child in question?" "Yes, sir." "And the public witness?" "Sunday last," Preacher Cross spoke up. "Country chapel, I presided. Half the congregation heard her sing." "Including Patroller Benton," Dr. Hart added. He was there in official capacity. Judge Rawlins leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he considered the legal implications. Outside, the storm continued to rage, lightning illuminating the windows in stark white flashes. "The writing appears authentic," he said slowly, "and a dying person's instructions carry considerable legal weight. But there's the matter of property law." "She's not property," Ruth said quietly, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the chambers. "Never has been, in God's eyes. Margaret knew that. That's why she wrote what she wrote." The judge looked at her sharply. "You realize you're speaking about legal matters that could affect your own status?" "Yes, sir. I'm speaking about my daughter's future. About promises made by a woman who loved us both." Rawlins stood and moved to the window, looking out at the storm-lashed square below. The crowd hadn't dispersed. If anything, more people had arrived, drawn by word of what was happening in the courthouse chambers. "There's been some irregularities," he said finally. "Deputy Kane filed charges this evening. Claims there's Underground Railroad activity, illegal manumission, possibly federal crimes." "Kane's fishing," Tom Albright said bluntly. "He's got no evidence of federal crimes." "No? What about the travel plans, the ferry arrangements, the coded singing?" Silence fell over the chambers. Outside, thunder rumbled like God's own judgment, and the lamplight flickered as the wind found gaps in the old windows. Then Elsie stepped forward, the family Bible still clutched in her arms. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear despite her youth, "may I show you something?" Judge Rawlins looked surprised. "Child, this is a court proceeding. She can read Latin." "Your Honor, Doctor," Hart interrupted. "Been helping with medical texts for over a year. Her education's legitimate." The judge gestured for Elsie to approach his desk. She opened the Bible to the relevant page and pointed to a notation they'd all overlooked, a tiny mark in the margin beside Margaret's signature. "See this mark? It's Mrs. Mercer's seal ring impression, same one that's on file with the county clerk." She pressed it into the ink while it was still wet, to prove the writing was hers. Rawlins bent closer, examining the tiny seal impression with a magnifying glass. His expression grew more serious as he recognized the authenticity markers. "Remarkable," he murmured. "She thought of everything." "Yes, sir. She loved us enough to make sure. The law couldn't be twisted against us." The judge straightened, looking around the room at the assembled witnesses. These people had come out in a dangerous storm to see justice done. That meant something, carried weight beyond mere legal technicalities. "Very well," he said finally. I'll need to verify the handwriting against court documents, compare the seal impression with filed records. But if everything checks out, he paused, looking directly at Ruth and Elsie. If everything checks out, I see no legal impediment to honoring a dying woman's wishes. The room erupted in quiet celebration, handshakes and embraces, tears of relief and joy. Outside, the crowd seemed to sense that something important had happened, their voices rising in another verse of the hymn that had started it all. But Judge Rawlins held up a hand for silence. There's still the matter of the public ceremony. If I'm to rule this manumission legal, it needs to be done proper, witnessed and recorded according to law. When? Silas asked. The judge looked toward the window, where the first faint light of dawn was beginning to show through the storm clouds. Now, he said simply, while the witnesses are here and the papers are ready, on the courthouse steps, where county business belongs. The storm was breaking at last, wind beginning to die down and rain softening to a steady patter. Soon the sun would rise on a new day, and with it the final resolution of promises made and debts of honor finally paid. Dawn came pale and tentative through the breaking storm clouds, washing the courthouse square in silver light. The crowd had grown through the night, word spreading from house to house despite the weather. Now over 100 people gathered on the wet brick courtyard, their faces turned toward the courthouse steps, where history would be written in ink and witnessed in the clear morning air. Judge Rawlins emerged from the great oak doors carrying a leather portfolio and an ornate wooden box containing the county's official seals. Behind him came Clerk Tally, summoned from his bed to verify documents and make everything legal. The two men's faces were serious as preachers at a funeral, understanding the weight of what they were about to do. "Citizens of the county," Judge Rawlins called, his voice carrying clearly in the still air, "we are gathered to witness the fulfillment of a legal document, written and sealed by Margaret Mercer in the final days of her life." He opened the portfolio and withdrew the family Bible, handling it with the reverence due to sacred text. The morning light caught the gold lettering on the cover, making it gleam like a lamp in the growing brightness. "Clerk Tally has verified the handwriting against court records. The seal impression matches county files. The witnesses to the original document have testified under oath." His eyes swept the crowd, taking in familiar faces from across 3 counties. "Therefore, I rule the manumission clause to be legal and binding." A murmur rippled through the assembly, but Rawlins held up his hand for continued silence. "However, the document specifies a condition that must be met in public witness. The child must sing before God and congregation in the presence of county officials." He looked directly at Elsie, standing between Ruth and Silas at the foot of the steps. "Are you prepared to fulfill this condition?" Elsie nodded, her small hands clasped in front of her clean dress. Ruth had found time to wash and mend the grey linen, and now it looked respectable if not fine. The blue ribbon in her hair caught the morning light like a flag of hope. "Step forward then, child." Elsie climbed the courthouse steps alone, each footfall echoing off the stone. At the top, she turned to face the crowd, all those faces looking up at her with expectation and hope and the weight of their own consciences. The square fell completely silent. Even the birds seemed to pause in their morning songs, waiting to hear what would come from this small girl's throat. Elsie opened her mouth and sang, "Guide me, O thou great Jehovah, pilgrim through this barren land. I am weak, but thou art mighty. Hold me with thy powerful hand." Her voice rose clear and true, reaching every corner of the square and beyond. It was the same tune that had stilled the chapel on Sunday, but now it carried the weight of legal testimony, of promises fulfilled and debts of honor finally paid. The crowd stood transfixed. Men removed their hats, women bowed their heads. Children pressed closer to their parents, sensing something sacred in the morning air. When the final note faded, Judge Rawlins stepped forward. "The condition has been met," he announced, witnessed by county officials and citizens alike. "Clerk Tally, prepare the manumission papers." Tally spread documents on a portable table, his pen scratching across the legal forms that would transform lives with simple strokes of ink. Judge Rawlins affixed the county seal, pressing the heavy metal stamp into warm red wax. "Ruth," he called, "step forward." She climbed the steps with dignity, her head high, one hand smoothing her best apron. At the top, she stood beside Elsie as Tally handed her the completed documents. By the authority invested in me by the state and county, Judge Rawlins intoned, I declare Ruth and her daughter Elsie to be free persons, released from bondage according to the written wishes of Margaret Mercer and the laws of this land. The crowd erupted. Cheers and applause echoed off the courthouse walls, hats thrown into the air, tears flowing freely down weathered faces. But through it all, Ruth and Elsie stood quietly on the courthouse steps, hands clasped, as if they couldn't quite believe the words they'd just heard. Silas climbed to join them, his face wet with tears he made no effort to hide. There's more, he said, his voice carrying over the celebration. Another document that Margaret left, sealed and witnessed separate from the manumission clause. Judge Rawlins looked surprised. What document? Preacher Whitcomb came forward, carrying a small wooden box bound with the same blue ribbon that decorated Elsie's hair. The late Mrs. Mercer left this with me, with instructions to open it only after the manumission was completed. He untied the ribbon and lifted the box's lid. Inside, wrapped in silk, lay a simple gold ring and a folded paper bearing Margaret's seal. What does it say? Judge Rawlins asked. Preacher Whitcomb unfolded the paper and read aloud, To my husband Silas, Ruth has been wife to my heart, though not in law. If God grants me rest and her freedom, I ask that you give her the honor that I was unable to provide in life. Let her be called by the name she deserves, in the sight of God and this community. Silence fell over the square. This was unexpected. A final gift from a dying woman to the people she'd loved most in the world. Silas took the ring from the box, his hands trembling slightly. Ruth, he said, his voice thick with emotion, Margaret wanted you to have this, not as master to servant, but as one free person to another. Will you accept it? Ruth looked at the ring, then at Silas, then at the crowd of witnesses gathered below. Her whole life had led to this moment, from slave quarters to courthouse steps, from silence to the freedom to speak her own heart. I will, she said simply. Judge Rawlins stepped forward again. Then let it be recorded that this day, in the sight of God and these witnesses, Silas Mercer and Ruth take each other in lawful marriage, with all rights and privileges pertaining thereto. He slipped the ring onto Ruth's finger as the crowd watched in awed silence. It was a simple ceremony, but no less binding for its brevity. When it was done, Ruth was no longer a freed slave. She was Mrs. Ruth Mercer, wife and mother and citizen, with all the rights those titles carried. Elsie tugged at her mother's skirt. Mama, what do I call myself now? Ruth knelt down to her daughter's level. What would you like to be called? Elsie Mercer, the child said, without hesitation. Elsie Mercer, who sings, Then That's Who You Are. The celebration that followed spilled from the courthouse square into the streets of town. People brought food from their own tables, sharing breakfast with strangers and friends alike. The Methodist ladies produced coffee and cornbread, while the Baptist men contributed ham and eggs. But the most remarkable sight was at the courthouse steps themselves, where the three newest Mercers sat together on the stone, sharing a simple meal and watching the sun climb higher over the county they now called home as free people. Cale Benton appeared at the edge of the crowd, his patroller's badge glinting in the morning sun. For a moment, tension rippled through the assembly, but instead of challenging the proceedings, he simply touched, his hat brim to Judge Rawlins. Witnessed and recorded, he said officially. No complaints from the county patrol. Doctor. Hart clapped him on the shoulder. Good man, Cale. Takes courage to do right when it's not easy. As the morning progressed, plans were made. Silas would need to reorganize the plantation, paying wages now instead of providing mere sustenance. Ruth would manage the household as an equal partner, not a servant. And Elsie would continue her education, perhaps even attend the Methodist school when she was old enough. What about the hymn? Widow Albright asked as the crowd began to disperse. Will folks remember what it means, how it brought all this about? Preacher Whitcomb smiled. Some songs outlive the people who sing them. This one will be remembered. He was right. Years later, when the country was torn apart by war over the very questions that had been settled peacefully on the courthouse steps that morning, people would still sing, Guide me, O thou great Jehovah, and remember the day a child's voice changed hearts and minds in a single county in Mississippi. But for now, it was enough that three people sat together on stone steps in the morning sun, free to love each other without fear, free to build a future without the shadow of bondage falling across their path. Judge Rawlins gathered his papers and prepared to return to his chambers. Before leaving, he turned back to the family on the steps. "Mrs. Mercer," he said formally, "you and your husband will need to register your marriage with the county clerk. And young Miss Mercer will need a birth certificate now that she has a legal surname." "Yes, Your Honor," Ruth replied. "We'll see to it proper." The judge nodded and started to go, then paused. "One more thing. That hymn, it was beautiful. Your daughter has a rare gift." "Yes, sir." "She does, indeed." As the square emptied, the Mercer family remained on the courthouse steps, watching the sun climb toward noon. Around them, the ordinary business of a county seat resumed: merchants opening shops, lawyers heading to their offices, children running errands for their mothers. But nothing was quite the same as it had been before dawn. A precedent had been set, a principle established. Freedom could be won with courage and song. Justice could triumph over custom, and love properly witnessed and legally recorded could indeed conquer all. Elsie hummed softly as she braided the blue ribbon through her fingers. The same ribbon that had marked her as different now marked her as free. Soon it would tie around the completed manumission papers, binding them together as a family record for future generations to read and remember. The morning light caught the gold of Ruth's new wedding ring as she took her husband's hand and her daughter's hand. Three people united, not by law alone but by choice and love, and the grace of God, working through the voice of a child who sang truth into the morning air. In the distance, the chapel bell began to toll the hour, not a call to emergency or alarm, but the simple marking of time in a world where time now belonged to them as much as anyone else. The hymn was over, but its echo would continue as long as people remembered that sometimes the smallest voice carries the largest truth, and that freedom, once claimed in courage, becomes a song that others can learn to sing.